Thompson from EY Knowledge joins us to tell us more about this. Graham, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. First off, tell us whether the president has actually managed to reassure foreign investors.
Well, that's a bit of a tricky one. I think it's a bit early days yet, but certainly from what we're seeing in terms of some of the commitments, it does appear that there's far more appetite and far more investment interest in South Africa than I think we've seen for quite a while.
Yeah. Now, I see that South Africa actually shares the title of the largest FDI hub with Morocco. What makes us so attractive?
Well, that's not quite the whole story. So in actual fact, historically, South Africa, simply because of its sheer size and diversified economy, has always been the major FDI hub in Africa. And in fact, what happened for the first time in 2017 was that South Africa's FDI slipped to such an extent that it shared that first ranking with Morocco. And it's the first time we've ever found ourselves competing with another country that's even got close to us. So not quite the pretty picture you painted, but good that I guess if you think of the very low growth environment that we've experienced over the last couple of years, then perhaps not an unsurprising result.
Yeah. So we are losing our lead, which is basically what this points out to. What are the factors that actually have led to that?
Okay, so I think there's two things, two primary drivers. The one is, as I alluded to earlier, we've had very slow growth, and that's now been for a number of years. You would be well aware that in the first half of this year we went through a recession. There's a risk that that might actually extend further into the year. But be that as it may, investment typically follows growth, and we just haven't had any, really, as I say, for a good 5 years, been very tepid growth. Over and above that, the rest of Africa has actually been growing really nicely. And there's the well-known stories. There's Ethiopia growing at anywhere between 8 and 10% per annum. Cote d'Ivoire at a similar rate. Those really compete as best in class globally in terms of their growth rates. And of course, you've got the whole of East Africa that's been growing consistently well above 5% for a good 7 to 10 years. That is all very instrumental in driving investment into those countries. And I guess the other factor was, of course, North Africa after Arab Spring saw a very dramatic fall-off in FDI. That now seems to be reversing and playing out, and there's more of an investor appetite and more investments going back into those countries.
And of course, I see that Zimbabwe is one of the countries that's also people are showing interest in. The new rule, the change of president, of course, playing a part there. And what else? What's the attractiveness apart from the policy and presidential change? Yeah,
I think a lot of optimism, a lot of hope that after 40 very difficult years that, there might be more pragmatism, there might be a renewed enthusiasm from government to really say we acknowledge we have a major unemployment problem, and the only way we're going to address that is through investment. Now, then what we saw last year was perhaps a little bit premature because we did see a major increase, as you say, in FDI into Zimbabwe. Having said that, off a very low base. So if you think about if you get 2 projects in the next year, you get 4, well, you've doubled your FDI, but it's still a low absolute number. And I think that's very much the situation that Zimbabwe is still in right now. And of course, we've seen the recent events of the last couple of weeks, which really does still talk to a lot of uncertainty, currency shortages. All of those things are very likely to impact investor sentiment. And so who knows what the picture might look like this year.
Yeah. So tell us who are our major investors in Africa?
Yeah, so interesting one. What we've found, and we found that this holds true right through the last 15 years, and that's as long as we've been tracking this data, you will very much see that the historical links to a country really determine where your investment comes from. So France is a major investor in French-speaking Africa, including North Africa like Algeria, Morocco. The US and the UK are major investors in South Africa and the other English-speaking African nations. And then you've got Portugal and Brazil, very instrumental investors in Angola and Mozambique. Now, having said that, and those remain very much the historical investment ties to Africa, having said that, you are now starting to see more influence coming both from China and from India on a more meaningful scale. So we're slowly seeing a shift away from developed to emerging markets, but it's a very slow shift.
Yeah. So let's talk about the attention on the continent. I saw your research here. It, of course, shows that there are major opportunities in Africa. but there needs to be changes to actually capitalize on those opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. So we talk about the need for policy reform and the resolve to carry out those reforms. And in fact, you might have noticed we called this year's report Turning Tides. And why we called it that was really because you've seen quite a fundamental change in political leadership across quite a few countries. And that carried over into this year in Ethiopia, for example. And on the back of that, you're seeing a more pragmatic economic policy being adopted. And so it really is a changing of tides in terms of, from old to new, and a little bit of turmoil that goes with shifting tides. And that's really why we do say that we see a greater sense of urgency in terms of reform, in terms of making yourself more attractive to business. And that in itself seems to us to indicate a recipe for success. So just to give an example, Rwanda, for its tiny economy, attracts 1.5 FDI projects for every $1 billion of GDP. And Angola, on the other hand, gets 0.02 projects for every $1 billion of GDP. So massive difference, but a very strong differentiator in how they approach attracting capital and business into their respective countries.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. I appreciate it.